Hi, everyone. I think we're probably ready to get started. So I wanted to begin today by asking you all if you had any questions. I had a couple of questions over email that I thought I would just kind of broadcast to everybody, because I'm sure they're questions that you might be thinking about. But before then, I guess I was just curious if you had any questions from that big, syllabus dump that we did last week. Anybody? Okay, I'll share with you a couple of questions that I got over email. One question was, I can't, and this is addressed to me, and it's sort of like, hey, Meg, I can't make it to lab for this reason, whatever, good reason, probably. What should I do? If your question is about lab attendance or anything related to lab, you should contact your TA. And your TA's address is provided for you in the syllabus. If you don't know who your TA is, you can find out by doing a class schedule search. Looking at your class schedule, it should actually be in there. If for some reason you're completely baffled by that process and you need assistance, by all means, email me. I'm happy to help. I'm just not usually the best person to help you out with that particular question. Another question I received was, hey, Meg, I can't come to lecture for blah, blah reason, probably a good reason. Great. So do I have to make anything up? No, although recordings are provided for your convenience and for your learning convenience. So that would be the only thing that you have to do if you're not able to make it to lecture. Any questions about that? Okay. I also did want to make one quick announcement before I kind of jump into the lecture. And that quick announcement is that, in general, lecture recordings are going to be available the day of lecture. They're actually recorded during lecture, so I can't make them available ahead of time. But I should be able to have them recorded and posted by 5 o'clock. I'm going to say like maybe a soft deadline there. I have another class immediately after this class, so I might not be able to post it right away like I usually do. It may have to be like more early evening, hopefully before dinner. That'll be my before dinner goal for everybody. So just don't expect them to kind of like pop up 2 minutes after lecture, because that's not going to happen. But definitely same day is pretty much guaranteed. If for some reason you don't see the lecture posted, it probably means that I had some kind of drama in my life and I didn't get to it, or maybe I just forgot it. That has happened before. So if it's not up by, evening time, feel free to send me a reminder email. Chances are I possibly just forgot, and it takes me all of like 15 seconds to post it. So no big deal there. Any other questions? Any questions at all? All right, excellent. So this week, in our class this week, we're going to be kind of going back in time. And we're going to be encompassing almost the entirety of human history in 2 days. How can we accomplish this astounding feat, you ask? Well, we're skipping some parts, and we are only going to talk about the parts that's really significant moments in art and technology. So let's go. So if I kick in my slideshow here, you may notice that when I put together slides, I sometimes have supplementary information in the slides. One of the big questions that I get asked by students that doesn't necessarily have to do with course content is like, what am I going to have to memorize for the exam? Oh, gosh. I'll give you a hint. If it's actually written on a slide, or even better, if it's one of these study questions, hint, hint, those are the things that I'm going to kind of emphasize or go towards for exam questions. If I have something that is literally hidden in a slide, and it says, hey, did you know that there's this cool movie about this image that you can watch with Scarlett Johansson? When she was like a little baby? Yeah, little baby. She, that movie, by the way, is called Girl with a Pearl Earring. Do you need to watch that movie? Will it be on the exam? No. That's just in case you're like interested and you want to watch a cool movie. So there's quite a bit of like supplementary information in the course, and I'll be kind of pointing that out to you at great length at some point. By the way, this is not going to be on the exam. This is designed to spark your interest in the topic further if you're interested. Okay, so I tried to make that pretty obvious because I don't want people to like waste time doing stuff that they don't need to do. So today, we are going to have some study questions for our lecture today. This is the kind of lecture that does really well with these types of questions. I would say probably about 40 to 50% of the course is sort of what I would call traditional lecture. And then the other half, probably more than half of the class, is actually me demonstrating how to do stuff in various software tools. So for the first week, because we have sort of a little bit of a hill to climb with getting everybody's software installed and getting everybody kind of on the same page, making sure we're all fully present here in our head cases and ready to learn, we are going to start off with a sort of context and sort of really thinking about how we got where we are right now today. And so this series of lectures, there's two of them. It's called History of Art and Technology Parts 1 and Part 2. History of Art and Technology Part 1 goes about to the World War II era. And then the second half, you can probably guess, is a much more compressed period of time. That second lecture is really the post-computer era, or basically when we had actual computers to talk about. So today we're going to be talking about some kind of background material related to art and technology. What is the etymology of the word technology? Have you ever thought about that? You're going to today. What technological advances of the Renaissance gave the artist a new way to see objects in space? We'll talk about all of these things. So I don't usually read these questions at the beginning of class, but I'm just kind of taking the opportunity to say, if these questions are here, they're here for a reason. And the reason is the midterm or the final. So that's pretty much all there is to say about that. So when we think about technology, I mean, obviously this is a really fascinating time that we're living in, and we can think about technology in maybe even a kind of like intimate way. We literally are carrying it around on our bodies. Probably many of you might have other wearables like watches or headphones that are Bluetooth enabled. And that type of ubiquity is certainly, for most of human history, the exception and not the rule. That we're coming to a moment in history where we're very sort of suffused. And I would say, if we're thinking about this in like art theory terms, we would say we're gooey. We're gooey with technology, as in that it's kind of like all over us. It's in us. It's like this material that we navigate every single day. But really what I hear when I talk to most people is a sort of vernacular or common sense understanding of what technology actually is. So in other words, if you ask somebody just like on the street, or maybe you ask your parents, or I don't know, somebody who may or may not have sort of access to like a lot of academic discourse, and you ask them what technology is, they're probably going to come up with something related to digital tools, like computers or phones. And that's a fine definition. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a very common sense definition. And here at UW-Madison, we do not believe in common sense. Oh, no. Maybe a tiny bit. No, I think that what you sort of find is that if you actually look into the etymology or really the history of the word technology, we could take it all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And what they're working on, or what they're working with, is a series of concepts that don't really line up with where our lives are shaping our language currently. So we have two roots. We have techne and logos. And so techne, put simply, is to craft. In other words, it's related to the process of creation. That's pretty vague. Being someone who kind of maybe likes art theory a little bit, it tends to be like the vaguer the better in terms of humanities language. So then we've also got this word logos, which is literally knowledge of a thing. In this case, knowledge of the craft or knowledge of the discourse. So this opens up some interesting possibilities. I'm thinking of the several sort of new religious movements in our society right now that talk about their techniques for maybe like doing, like I'm thinking specifically of the Church of Scientology and how they refer to their practices as technology. Whoa, that's different. We just went like over there, right? And the reason that they refer to their practices as technology, there's a really minimal level of actual technology used. So what they're referring to are interpersonal psychological techniques. And so the idea is that the technique, the description of the technique, is actually the technology. And you'll see that actually that if you're a student of cults or new religious movements, if you follow some of some practices, and by follow I don't mean like follow, I mean like look at in a more dispassionate way. It's actually pretty common in certain new religious movements to speak about like spiritual technology. And it's not something that really lines up with how we would normally think of technology, right? Or just what we would think of as technology. Another place you might see technology used in that way is actually in education. So in a totally maybe more legitimate way, a lot of people have sort of non-material techniques that are taught to people in sort of like a workshop or something like that, and then you learn the technique, and then you have the technology, literally. So I guess all this to say, like, what does it say about maybe our society that we put such kind of narrow blinders on what constitutes technology? Is this technology? Is this a work of technology? Totally, right? Does it fit in with that kind of common sense, like digital computer phone stuff, shorthand definition of technology? No, it does not. So I guess I would think about maybe one sort of like thought experiment that I want you to kind of carry on with in this class is maybe to just reflect now and then on what actually is technology. Is this chair technology? Yeah, it's not super sophisticated, but it's technically technology. And especially when thinking about it in terms of art, we're living in a time where really anything can be art. What does that mean? Like literally anything. Can I come up with like an example off the top of my head? Sure. I mean, I think performance art is probably the sort of standard bearer of that anything can be art kind of ethos. Of course, there are lots of people who prefer art to be image-based or sort of more traditionally bought things that can be bought and sold, like paintings, for example, or prints. But in that landscape of tons and tons and tons of different materials and practices being art, you can understand, or maybe sort of intuit, how a more expansive definition of technology might be useful for us. And so we'll come back to that as we kind of go on through the semester. We'll look at works that probably defy this sort of boundary in a good way. So when we think about history, we can think about the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, there were a couple of developments that led to the development of material technology. And so in this case, I guess I can separate, material technology meaning literally like what is the stuff that we make art from. And then maybe immaterial technology is that sort of what's the process, how do we communicate it, that kind of thing. So in the Renaissance, there, by the way, this is because of colonialism. There were a couple of new paint colors that were introduced to the Western world, and we see those a lot in Italian Renaissance painting. Now, you may be asking yourself, what do you mean they were introduced? Like, where were they before? And I would say that trading along the Silk Road pulled certain materials out of the sort of area that used to be called, or that is now called Afghanistan, and the whole sort of steppes areas all the way into China. And so what were people doing with those colors before we, and I'm this huge air quotes here, discovered them? Oh, they were making paintings with blue in them, and everything was just fine. So something that was really like not even a thing, and when I say not a thing, like they, people who maybe were trading these elements, were like, yeah, we got blue, it's awesome. What's wrong with you? Why don't you have blue? And of course, the reason why they didn't have blue in the Western world is because it was a mineral that was actually mined extracted from the earth. And so it's a really common sort of history, right? This sort of let's extract wealth from other areas, let's extract wealth from other countries, and let's not really think about it until like 20 years ago, maybe. As a culture, that was kind of when we started to have a deeper investigation into where some of these materials came from, right? So, I mean, the history of colonialism is a little bit outside of the topic of this class, but I do think it's really important to kind of just acknowledge that a lot of what are sort of heralded as discoveries or heralded as, achievements are actually maybe not. Maybe, yeah. So, on that cheery note, the other big, aside from new materials, the other big sort of thing that we see coming through during the Renaissance, which is huge, is the invention of the portable canvas. So you can imagine, I think people's typical reaction to this is like, what? Like, what do you mean you invented the portable canvas? Like, how is that not a thing? I don't know. Basically, what you had seen in painting up to the time of the Renaissance is a fresco-style painting. So, for example, like this sort of wonderful terracotta painting on the wall here. Imagine it, much more complicated, much more beautiful, and oh, by the way, it's part of the building. So instead of having this culture of portable canvases where you can buy canvases and you can take them home and then you can put them on your shelves and you can impress all your friends with your new paintings that you spent all this money to buy, and it's a status symbol. Before that, people actually used to have to go to the painting. Crazy. Blows my mind. Every time And so one of the reasons why there was this real focus on paintings in place was because the only art that was made in the Middle Ages, for the most part, was religious work. So these are the insides of, religious spaces. And so it's really one of the other things that I probably don't mention here, but within the Renaissance, another sort of new thing was this whole idea of the merchant class. And that's something that really enabled this whole idea of disposable income, and maybe I can actually buy a painting and hang it on my wall, and everyone else will know how cool I am because I bought this painting. So that's basically sort of how that sort of got shaped. There were also some other technological advances in the so-called Renaissance. So we also had a couple of new tools that were really significant. And those tools were things like the glass grid and the camera obscura. So the use of the camera obscura for a while was kind of the best kept secret in Renaissance art. And what do I mean by best kept secret? I don't think it really came out until maybe like about 20 years ago that artists in the Renaissance weren't just like preternaturally skilled or gifted, that they were actually using tools to help them see and to help them draw. And this is the really shocking part. It's not shocking to me, but they were tracing. Just like, shudder! My preconceptions of what individual talent in the arts look like is completely shattered. Maybe, maybe not, right? I mean, I think a lot of people today, maybe because our culture is so infused with technology, the idea that artists were literally using devices to help them divide sections on a page so that their subject would look more realistic, I don't know, it seems like just smart to me. Like, why wouldn't you if you could, right? And this sort of like picks at some of the cultural mythology of the artist and of painting in general. And so if you think about painting is really kind of the last place in the art world for people to have a sort of myth of the hand being like a conduit of their individual genius. And I say that with some skepticism because I don't really believe in that personally, but yeah, it's still a thing. I mean, there is something to the idea of actually looking at something and then drawing it, right? And then somebody can say, wow, that's amazing. You're really good at that. So having this sort of a technology that kind of undermines that is, it's interesting. Now, when I say, again, technology, this is like utterly primitive, like not sort of very sophisticated technology. But what you can see here is a camera obscura. So a camera obscura is very closely related to this glass grid, where in this case you can see Albrecht Dürer. This is a self-portrait of the artist. He's basically looking at this sort of nether region. If you haven't already been able to sort of think about this, these knees coming forward, if you've ever drawn a person where it's a so-called foreshortened view, that can really be kind of a nightmare. It's like life drawing on nightmare mode. And so having that grid there to help really is super helpful. But as you can see, he's not directly tracing the image. Enter the camera obscura, which this is a room-sized camera obscura. If you ever get a chance to go into one, I would highly recommend it. Sometimes they have them at art fairs and things like that. And basically what it is it's just a pinhole. If anybody has ever used a pinhole camera, it's a giant pinhole camera. So you put a pinhole here, over here, and it projects the image of whatever's outside the box. And then the cool part about using something like this is you can actually come in with a piece of paper and kind of directly trace, there's that word again, your sort of masterful image. So one thing you'll find is that probably the cultural moment where the wool got sort of, or the curtain got pulled back on some of these artists was probably this moment with this artist named Johann Vermeer. And of course, art historians had been erroneously writing about his sort of masterful drawing style and his masterful understanding of space for decades, up to the point that they discovered that he actually used camera obscuras in his studio. And so it's sort of an interesting moment for the art world in some ways, because from my perspective, it's just sort of acknowledging what artists automatically do, which is they would use pretty much anything at their disposal to improve their outcome, right? So I'm kind of like looking at this being like, yeah, it's not really that big of a deal. But the reason it was a big deal is because, this person had been mythologized so intensely for basically not doing these things. And again, excellent movie. So the other super huge thing that happened in the Renaissance that we just have to talk about, we can't not talk about it, is the invention of the printing press. Now, was the printing press, trick question, was the printing press in use in other cultures at this time? Yeah. Was it a printing press? It wasn't exactly the same, but yeah, could we also contribute, or could we also attribute this so-called discovery to the negative fruits of colonialism? Yeah, unfortunately. So basically what made the printing press unique from other sort of printing methods is, it used to be, back in the day, you would carve a wooden block and you would smush a piece of paper on it and you get a print, right? I think everybody can kind of figure out how that works. And then you're done. The real innovation was not that. That was already something that existed in culture. The innovation was, let's make a bunch of blocks that fit together that you can rearrange. Whoa. It's called movable type, right? That actually was the real innovation. And so what did movable type give people? Well, it gave people the ability to have their voices heard beyond how far they could yell, which is pretty profound and pretty useful. Who controlled all the knowledge in the world up to the point of the printing press? Like in the Western world, definitely the Catholic Church. Other sort of, hierarchies, like I'm thinking of, monarchical dynasties certainly had an impact, and they also had the ability to print. But yeah, basically, I think it's not an unfair comparison to compare the printing press to the internet. And what do I mean by that? It's not because necessarily that your TikTok video can be viewed by 5 million people. It's more the fact that you can even make a TikTok video and have other people see it, even if it's just one person. That ability didn't exist. And it's kind of like we're such, in our culture right now, we're such voracious media, many of us are voracious media producers, that it's really hard for me to even think of not having that ability, right? So yeah, one quick distinction, which is going to show up on the final exam. So I'll just clarify this. So the portable canvas gives us the ability to do what? It gives us the ability to take one image and move it around in space. It can exist in multiple places, but not at the same time, right? Because if it's a painting, there's probably only one copy. Now, if it's a printed document, it can exist in multiple places at the same time because you're making multiple copies. That is an actual exam question. I'm tired of people getting that question wrong, so I thought I'd just tell you. Yeah.
How advanced were the images they could make with the printing press? That they could like reproduce something on the scale of paintings. What was the type of?
Super advanced. Yeah, if you look at like, well, like for example, this engraving is pretty highly detailed. And we'll talk about, in just a couple of minutes, we'll talk about sort of the development of printmaking, because printmaking does sort of create this kind of interesting industry, which is technical drawing and technical illustration, and that all happens through print, because it's like, if pretty much, even still today, to be honest, like if I were to make a steel engraving plate, that is the most precise way that you can make an image. And I have all kinds of robots to make images for me, so like it's still, just the fact that it's in steel and that it's that material. That's why they print paper money out of steel engraving plates. Yes, right. And no, we can't do that. I've asked. Okay, so yeah, you also see this sort of, in the Renaissance, this sort of thing that people love to link with art and technology, and that's that whole idea of, I'm sorry, I'm gonna barf a tiny bit in my mouth, the Renaissance man. I'm joking, guys. No, I'm just, let's say Renaissance person, but he was completely a dude, this guy, Leonardo. And so it is definitely like kind of a male mythos, right? That you're this genius at everything, right? And that sort of follows art around for quite some time. And I would say, to be honest, it probably still is in the art world today. There's a really popular journal of art and technology called Leonardo. Yeah, it's sort of, again, this idea that there was a person who excelled in multiple spheres. That couldn't have happened in the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages, you, as a potential person in the world, had really no upward mobility or no sort of ability to self-determine even what your career would be. So we see people like Leonardo being sort of put out there, and did he do a lot of amazing things? Yeah, sure. I guess one important thing that I sort of go to, maybe back to about Leonardo, is that there's a sort of, if you really look at some of his drawings, like this is a drawing for a cannon, he really was doing almost everything, like designing weaponry, designing medical devices, designing medical imaging technologies. There's a lot that was going on there. One of the most interesting things for me is when you look at his drawings and you can see where something started to kind of bleed over into the next thing. Here is a study for some medical devices, and here's a study for a cannon. And I guess one of the things I was always interested in is just how somebody can be spread so thin and not sort of just end up as like a pool of Jell-O, So that's maybe my own personal observation. So we have this span of time, this is like about 200 years, where the Renaissance is most definitely over, and in the Western world, we're sort of just now getting to this point where we have something that sort of resembles the modern era, or what art history people like to call modernity. So this is really kind of a transition period, but there are two important things that I wanted to bring up. And one is, well, three. One is this whole idea of the Age of Enlightenment, which maybe not sort of like also true is the age of colonialism. Interesting. And during that span of time, an incredible source of wealth is coming into the European and the British economy. Where is it coming from? Mostly from India and Africa, right? That's pretty much what was happening at that time. So during that period of time, this whole idea of science as a thing becomes an actual thing. Like, science really wasn't a thing. If we go back to Leonardo here, in the Renaissance, maybe Leonardo was making weapons, and maybe he used principles that are close to science. But there was no job called scientist back in the 1600s. You start to have career scientists, which we could also, maybe if we're being a little bit uncharitable, we could call that maybe playboy with a bad case of too much spending money. That's tended to be sort of how scientists came about. I'm being a little bit cheeky, but no, really, like, who was able to be a scientist in the 1700s? Well, first of all, definitely people with money, lots of money. And who were those people that had lots of money? Typically, they're nobility, and they're basically just looking for something to do. It's a terrible sort of like problem. There were no sort of like, there were no pipelines that we would normally think of today as like pipelines for achievement, right? Or pipelines for social mobility. So basically you have like bored nobility getting into what they call science. And of course it's done with the goal that it's supposed to improve humanity or whatever. And maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I don't know. One particularly interesting work of science that we probably will chat about a little bit is the difference engine. So if you're a computer science nerd or a computer history nerd, this is basically like the Ford Model T of computers. So it actually performs some calculations. Yeah. And guess how it moves? Like, it's totally a thing of formal beauty. If you look at it, it just moves really, really slowly, and it moves these dials, and then you count up the dials when you're done, and you're like, oh my God, that's amazing. So really, it's kind of pointed to by many, many people as really like the first actual computer. And we also see something called the birth of the industrial arts movement. And so someone had asked earlier about printmaking, and I guess I would say that in this period of time is really like the blossoming of what would come to be known as like industrial design or even technical illustration, technical art. And all of that stuff is kind of happening because of or along with the development of printmaking techniques. So you have this sort of like interest, in astronomy and this sort of very sort of artfully done technical and scientific illustrations. You also see really elaborate designs for objects that are going to be produced as part of industrial arts. And this whole idea of industrial arts is kind of anachronistic. Like, it kind of died out maybe in the early 1900s, well, at least here in this country. Industrial arts, weirdly, in Europe and even in other economies is still completely a thing. So I'm not 100% sure. I think a lot of the reason why people don't do industrial arts, or it's not even really like a popular career path in this country, is because we don't really do manufacturing in this country anymore. And so what is the product of most industrial arts? It's made goods. So I think it's a cool thing to do. And certainly there are lots of other economies in the world where industrial arts is still a really important part of the economy. So it's not, I wouldn't say that it's dead, it's just hasn't really been happening here. Yeah, look no further than, this brick, which I'm sure was not designed here. So you do see this sort of like flowering of industrial arts really all over the world, and it's sort of being led by industrial applications like milling, so like making small metal parts, right? Casting, basically all the sort of things that make your vacuum cleaner or your blender, that type of stuff. And the reason that I'm pointing this out or making a big deal out of this is because at some point in this country, at least, and probably something like in Scandinavian countries, there was a moment where artists really started using a lot of these tools. And that was called the industrial arts movement of the last century. So, and that's actually something that people are still doing. So, one other thing I wanted to kind of think about is like, when we think about the history of technology, or we think about, all this sort of, really just this sort of breadth of what has happened and how we can maybe do this like really bad job of encompassing it, which, it's, give me some credit, like it's 800 years or something. How do we look at things now that we maybe don't understand or we don't have on the horizon yet? And how are those things, even when people look at us, how are people going to look at what might even be fiction, right? So if I think about some crazy room where like I step into a pile of goo, and then this like headdress covers my head, and then I'm just basically like the hybrid in the Battlestar Galactica Cylon or something, and I have this like direct neural link with something else. Well, that's definitely mostly fictional right now at this moment, but it's a reflection of like our cultural imaginary, right? And so just to give you an idea, I think it's really impressive that even back in 1900 something, people were thinking about anthropomorphic androids. That's kind of amazing. Of course, they were nowhere near there yet, and we're almost like not really there. If you've ever seen any stair climbing robots, you know where I'm coming from with this. But it's like, where are we actually, and where are we in the imaginary? Are two sort of interesting things to think about. So in terms of art, like I'm going to pick up the sort of art brick here around 1912. You start to see art being created in the post-World War, even pre-World War I, post-World War I period, where art kind of took on a very different pose. And what do I mean by a pose? I mean, well, up to this point, you've got sort of your standard genres of art. You've got landscape painting, you've got rich person on a horse painting, you've got, noble lady with glorious hat photo painting. And so, there's like standard genres that we've seen forever. Everybody's seen stuff like this. And so after World War I, or around the time of World War I, artists started to really feel like, and y'all might be able to relate to this, wow, nothing matters anymore. Like, my life is not turning out the way I wanted it to, everything sucks, people can't be trusted, people are basically like walking human piles of garbage, and I have to live here. So that basically is reflected in the art, right? What's going on in this painting? Who can really say? Who knows, right? So this is the point at which painting and art in general became kind of so-called non-objective, meaning it's not necessarily a painting about or of anything. It's just a painting. And then the artist would be like, so just take your painting, and then he would like walk out of the room. I'm not going to do that. It's not my style. But yeah, there's this sort of like real urgent sort of like moment in art where things got really real. And of course, at the same time, some people's response to that was like, I don't know, everything's screwed up, you know, I'm basically throwing my hands up. The other reaction to that is, let's start a communist state. Another interesting reaction to, you know, the pointlessness of human existence. So yeah, definitely you also see technology being instrumentalized by state entities, right? As a way to kind of denote progress and to denote a society's sort of buy-in to progress. So this is a really famous work. It was actually made in reality, this monument to the Third International, which of course are the folks that got going on the Bolshevik Revolution, that thing. And I have 2 more minutes, so I am going to go ahead and show you, there are 2 sort of things that we're going to talk about, and we can kind of tie this in a little bit next week. I can fill in some of the gaps. I'll start here. But basically, we're going to talk about how the modern computer came to be. And you know, I know we had certainly given more than a couple of nods to colonialism and its role in sort of formulating some of the early innovations in art and technology. Well, I think here we could take this sort of like current iteration of technology, in other words, the computer, in all of its many forms, and we can really directly trace that back to World War II. And people doing what? Trying to build better weapons. Yes. This brick that I love so dearly was sort of forged in the fire of Mount Doom. Maybe not directly, but it certainly has you know, some sort of not so great history attached to it as well. Don't worry, I still love you. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about this. And basically that happened through code breaking. So what we can sort of currently identify as actual computers were code breaking devices made by the Germans and then sort of reverse engineered and unmade and made to break the code by the Allies. So it's a very sort of familiar story, and it holds up pretty well. What you may not know is that most of the code breakers in World War I, or World War II rather, were women. And that definitely kind of flies in the face of my narrative of total oppression of women at all times. It's just sad. No, well, the reason that they were selected is because they were excellent secretaries and they were detail-oriented. Which is like literally maybe the worst thing you've ever heard. Yeah, and then after the war, this group of people who did their jobs really well were basically asked to go home. And things went back to the way they were, which is, you know, carrying on with the sort of narrative of total oppression. So yeah, it's kind of a bummer. It's a good TV show about this, and I'm going to let you all go. We are scooting through that last bit there. I'll see you on Thursday. Hi.
Just out of curiosity, because like